America is often seen as a place of progress, innovation, and freedom, but that image leaves something out, because long before modern headlines, before true crime became entertainment, there were stories that people didn't just hear, they felt. Stories that made ordinary neighborhoods feel different at night. Stories that changed how people looked at the person next door. And the most unsettling part, many of those stories have been quietly forgotten. These are not the most famous names in history. These are the ones people stopped talking about, the ones who lived normal lives, until something about them wasn't normal at all. Edward Paisnell, the silent watcher, for years nothing about him stood out. He lived quietly, spoke normally, blended in so well that no one had a reason to look twice. And that's exactly why no one noticed when things started to feel off. It began with small complaints. A woman reported hearing footsteps outside her home late at night. Another claimed someone had been watching her through a window just for a second. At first, these incidents didn't connect, different streets, different times. But the feeling was the same. Someone was there, but never fully seen. As these reports slowly increased, a pattern started to form. Not obvious enough to cause panic, but enough to create unease. Because when something doesn't fully reveal itself, the mind fills in the gaps, and what people imagined was often worse than reality. Paisnell's presence was not loud, it didn't demand attention, it lingered quietly, just outside certainty. And that's what made it powerful, because the most unsettling individuals are not always the ones who act openly. They're the ones who remain just out of reach, seen but never fully understood. And for a long time, that's exactly where he stayed. Albert Fish, the man behind the mask of normalcy. If you had seen him on the street, you wouldn't have stopped. An elderly man, soft-spoken, unremarkable. The kind of person people walk past every day without thinking twice. And for years, that's exactly what happened. He lived quietly within society, surrounded by people who never questioned him. Neighbors described him as polite. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But that illusion didn't break all at once. It happened slowly, one detail at a time, until eventually, the truth could no longer stay hidden. What shocked people wasn't just the reality behind him, it was how long it had remained invisible. Because there were no obvious warning signs, no clear moment where everything changed, just a realization that something had been there all along, unnoticed. And once people understood that, it changed something deeper. They began to question normalcy itself, because if someone like him could exist without raising suspicion, then how many others could too? That question didn't have an answer, and that's what made it unsettling. The Axeman of New Orleans, a fear without a face. In 1918, New Orleans didn't just experience fear, it lived with it. It started without warning, a sudden incident that no one could fully explain. Then another, and another. There was no clear connection, no obvious pattern, and most importantly, no identity. People didn't know who they were afraid of, only that they should be. At one point, a message began circulating. It suggested something unusual, something that didn't just threaten but played with perception. Suddenly, fear wasn't just about safety, it became psychological. People stayed awake longer than usual. Some refused to sleep in silence. Others changed their routines entirely, not because they knew what would happen, but because they didn't. And that uncertainty spread faster than any confirmed detail ever could. The Axeman wasn't just a person. He became an atmosphere, a presence that existed in conversations, in silence, in the spaces between certainty. And when fear becomes that abstract, it stops being something you can escape, because it's no longer outside, it's inside the mind. Belle Gunness, the illusion of safety. At first there was nothing unusual about her. A hard-working woman, a farm, a life that seemed structured and stable. To neighbors, she represented something familiar, reliable, strong, someone who had built her life with determination. And that's what made everything else harder to see, because trust doesn't disappear overnight, it builds slowly. And once it's established, it creates a sense of certainty. But sometimes, that certainty is misplaced. Small inconsistencies began to appear. Not enough to raise alarm, just enough to create quiet questions. People who left didn't return, details that didn't quite align, moments that felt slightly out of place. Individually they meant nothing. Together they formed something else, a pattern. And once that pattern became visible, everything changed. Because it forced people to reconsider what they thought they understood. About her, about trust, about how easily appearances can be controlled. Her story wasn't just unsettling because of what was discovered. It was unsettling because of how long it remained hidden. Because sometimes, the safest looking places, the ones people question the least. Peter Curtin, the influence that crossed borders. Not all fear stays contained. Some stories travel. And when they do, they carry something with them. Peter Curtin was not American, but his story reached America at a time when people were beginning to understand something new, that human behavior could go far beyond expectation. Reports of his actions spread across newspapers. Discussions began to change, not just about crime, but about the mind behind it. For the first time, many people started asking different questions, not just what happened, but why. What drives someone? What creates that kind of thinking? And more importantly, can it be recognized before it's too late? Curtin's impact wasn't physical, it was psychological. He introduced a new layer of awareness, one that didn't bring comfort, but instead raised more questions than answers. And sometimes, questions are far more unsettling than facts. The Cleveland torso killer, a mystery that refused to end. In the 1930s, something began to happen in Cleveland, Ohio. At first, it was a single discovery, confusing, unsettling, difficult to fully understand. Then it happened again and again. Patterns started to form, but not the kind that brought clarity, the kind that raised more uncertainty. Because even as investigations expanded, answers didn't. Authorities tried to piece things together, to find logic, to find direction, but every step forward seemed to lead to more questions. And over time, something unusual happened. The case didn't just create fear. It created frustration, because people weren't just afraid of what was happening, they were afraid of not knowing who, not knowing why, not knowing if it would stop. And when a situation remains unresolved, it doesn't fade. It lingers, in conversations, in memory, in the quiet thought that something like that could happen again. Because the most disturbing stories are not always the ones with clear endings. They're the ones that don't end at all. And maybe that's what connects all of these names, not just what they did, but what they revealed. That fear doesn't always come from what we see. Sometimes it comes from what we don't. From the gaps in understanding, from the moments where certainty disappears. Because once that certainty is gone, everything feels different, even the things that once felt normal. And that's what makes these stories last. Not the headlines, not the names, but the feeling they leave behind. A quiet awareness that not everything is as it seems. By the mid-20th century, America believed it had begun to understand danger. There were systems now, processes, a growing sense that with enough structure things could be controlled, that unpredictability could be reduced, that patterns could be recognized in time. But history doesn't work that way, because no matter how strong systems become, there are always individuals who don't follow them, not loudly, not in ways that immediately stand out, but quietly, in ways that take time to notice. And by the time those patterns are seen clearly, they've already left their mark. 13. William Aaron's The Words That Didn't Settle the Truth, Chicago, 1940s. At first it was the pattern that drew attention, incidents that didn't seem connected, but didn't feel random either. Then came something unusual, a message, written in a way that didn't just describe actions but hinted at something internal, a struggle, a loss of control. It wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said, because it introduced a different kind of question, not just what happened, but what was happening inside the mind behind it. When William Aaron's became linked to the case, it surprised people. He didn't match expectations. Young, educated, someone who seemed to have direction. And that contrast created tension, because people rely on clear images to understand situations. And when reality doesn't match that image, certainty begins to break. But what made this case even more unsettling was what came after. The confession, because people are no longer just questioning the event, they're questioning the answer itself. And when the answer feels uncertain, the fear doesn't go away, it shifts. From what happened to what might never be fully understood. 14. Edward Gein, The Silence of Isolation, Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place where nothing unusual was expected to happen. Quiet roads, familiar faces, a rhythm of life that rarely changed. Edward Gein existed within that rhythm, but never fully as part of it. He lived simply, kept to himself, spoke little, stayed just distant enough to avoid attention. To most people, he was forgettable. And that's what made everything else harder to see. Because isolation doesn't always look alarming. Sometimes it looks like normal distance, but over time, something about that distance grows, it deepens, until the gap between a person and the world around them becomes something else entirely. When authorities finally looked closer, what they discovered didn't just shock people, it changed how they thought, because it revealed something uncomfortable, that a person can exist within society, yet slowly drift into a reality of their own. A reality that doesn't follow the same rules. And that disconnect is where the fear begins. Gein's story didn't just stay in history, it spread into books, into films, into the way people began imagining certain individuals, because it introduced a lasting idea that isolation, over time, can reshape reality itself. 15. Joseph Collinger, the pattern that wouldn't stay still. Some individuals follow patterns, consistent behavior, predictable responses. That's what allows people to understand them, to anticipate what comes next. Joseph Collinger didn't follow that structure. His behavior shifted, not gradually, but suddenly. At times he appeared stable, focused, functional. At other times something changed. His actions became harder to track, harder to understand, and that inconsistency created something more unsettling than chaos, uncertainty. Because when behavior doesn't follow a pattern, there is nothing to prepare for, no clear warning. Collinger's story is often examined through psychology, through the idea of a mind that doesn't operate in a steady way, a mind where internal conflict doesn't stay hidden, it surfaces unexpectedly, and that unpredictability becomes the central issue. Not just what might happen, but when and how, because without a stable pattern there is no clear way to define the limits. And what cannot be defined cannot be easily understood. And as these final names come together, a larger pattern begins to emerge, not one based on specific actions, but on something deeper, perception. Each of these individuals challenge the idea that danger is easy to recognize, that it announces itself clearly, that it gives people time to react, because again and again, history has shown something else, that some of the most unsettling individuals don't stand out at all. They exist within normal life, within familiar environments, within systems that are meant to create safety, and that's what makes their impact last, because they force a shift in understanding, a realization that control is never absolute, that certainty has limits, that even within structure there are gaps, and sometimes those gaps are enough. These are not just forgotten people. They are moments where confidence in the system weakened, where understanding didn't go far enough, where people were left with something difficult to accept, that not everything can be predicted, and not everything can be controlled. And maybe that's the part that stays with us, not what has already happened, but the possibility that something like it could exist again, quietly, unnoticed, until one day it isn't.
America built its image on progress, order, and control. But history doesn't stay controlled for long, because every now and then something slips through, not loudly, not in a way people immediately recognize, but quietly, through individuals who don't match what society expects, people who seem ordinary until one detail changes everything, and by the time that detail is noticed, it's already too late. H. Holmes, the man who designed Trust, Chicago, late 1800s, a city expanding faster than it could keep track of. New people arriving every day, new businesses opening overnight. In that chaos, one man found opportunity, not just in business, but in control. H. Holmes didn't just build structures, he designed experiences, places where people felt comfortable, spaces that didn't raise questions, and that was his advantage. Because when something feels safe, people stop looking deeper. Visitors entered without hesitation. Interactions felt normal, nothing seemed out of place, until small inconsistencies began to appear. Details that didn't fully align, moments that felt slightly off. Not enough to create panic, but enough to create doubt. And doubt, when ignored, grows. What made Holmes different wasn't unpredictability. It was precision. Everything had a purpose. Every decision was intentional. And that level of control allowed him to operate longer than anyone expected. Because people didn't fear him at first. They trusted him. And once trust is established, it becomes far more powerful than fear. Lizzie Borden, the day normal changed. August 1892, a quiet home in Massachusetts. A place where nothing unusual was expected to happen. And that's exactly why what happened next felt so unsettling, because it didn't come from outside. It came from within. Lizzie Borden was known in her community. Recognized, familiar. Someone people felt they understood. But when events unfolded, certainty disappeared. The case spread quickly across the country. Not just because of what happened, but because nothing about it felt clear. There were gaps, conflicting impressions, details that didn't fully connect. And at the center of it all was silence. A calm presence in a situation where calm didn't make sense. People expected visible emotion, shock, fear, reaction. But when those expectations weren't met, it created something deeper than confusion. It created discomfort. Because when behavior doesn't match the situation, the mind starts searching for answers. And when it doesn't find them, it creates its own. Lizzie Borden's story didn't just raise questions. It changed how people viewed certainty itself. Because after that moment, normal no longer felt predictable. Carl Panzram, the mind that didn't hide. Most unsettling individuals try to blend in. They hide, they adapt. Carl Panzram didn't. From the beginning, there was something different about the way he saw the world. Not controlled, not filtered, direct, cold, unapologetic. He didn't present himself as something he wasn't, and that honesty, its rawest form, was what made him difficult to understand. Because people rely on patterns, on expected behavior, on the idea that everyone operates within certain limits. Pansram didn't follow those limits, and when someone steps completely outside of them, they become unpredictable in a different way, not because they're hidden, but because they're fully visible without restraint. His mindset challenged something deeper than fear. It challenged understanding, because when someone believes in what they're doing without doubt, it removes the one thing people rely on most: hesitation. And without hesitation there is no warning. The unnamed patterns before fear had a name. Scattered incidents, different locations, different times, no clear connection. But when looked at closely, something began to emerge. A similarity, not in appearance, not in identity, but in approach. Detached actions, unclear motives, a distance between intention and emotion. These cases didn't have a central figure, no single name, no face to attach fear to, and that made them more difficult to process because fear without identity feels larger, more unpredictable, more present. People couldn't point to a single source, so the uncertainty spread, quietly. Gordon Northcott, The Power of Presence. In the 1920s, authority often came from how a person carried themselves. Confidence, structure, certainty. Gordon Northcott understood that. He didn't demand attention, he held it through tone, through control, through the way he presented himself to others. People followed his direction, not because they were forced to, but because it felt natural. And that's what made it effective, because the strongest forms of control are not imposed, they are accepted. Over time, that influence grew, quietly, without resistance, because when something feels normal, it isn't questioned, and when it isn't questioned, it isn't challenged. Northcott's story highlights something subtle but powerful. That perception can shape reality. The man no one could place. Across early American regions, there were always individuals who existed on the edge of society, not fully connected, not completely known. One such figure appeared in scattered reports, different places, different times, but always described in similar ways. A man who never stayed long, who spoke just enough, but never too much, whose presence felt incomplete. People remembered the feeling of the encounter but struggled to recall the details. Conversations that ended abruptly, moments that felt slightly out of place, nothing that could be proven, but enough to leave an impression. And impressions are where uncertainty begins. And as all of these stories come together, a pattern becomes visible, not just in actions but in perception. Because fear doesn't always come from what happens, sometimes it comes from what doesn't make sense, from the moments where understanding breaks, where certainty disappears. Because once that certainty is gone, everything feels different, even the things that once felt normal. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Not what we know, but how much we don't. Not every story ends with an answer. Some don't even end at all. They stay incomplete, circling back in conversations, resurfacing in fragments, leaving behind questions that refuse to settle. And sometimes, those unfinished stories become the most difficult ones to forget, because without answers, the mind keeps searching. The Mad Bomber of New York, the mind that spoke without a face. New York City. Late 1940s, a place defined by noise, movement, and constant activity. Thousands of people passing through the same spaces every day. And yet, within that chaos, something quiet began to happen. At first, it didn't seem connected. An isolated incident. Then another. Nothing obvious. Nothing that immediately pointed to a single source. But over time, a pattern began to form. Objects were being left behind, carefully placed, deliberately unnoticed. And then came the letters, typed messages sent to newspapers.com, controlled, almost methodical. They didn't sound emotional. They didn't sound rushed. They sounded precise. Whoever was writing them wasn't just trying to act, they were trying to communicate. And that changed everything. Because once communication begins, the situation becomes personal. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were reading, analyzing, trying to understand someone they couldn't see. The city didn't just feel unsafe. It felt watched. Because when someone can act quietly, and then explain themselves without revealing who they are, it creates a different kind of fear. One that isn't loud, but stays in the background, constant, unresolved. The Boy in the Box. The Story Without a Name. Philadelphia, 1957. A discovery was made that should have led to answers instead. It created silence. There were details, evidence, efforts to understand what had happened. But one thing was missing. Identity. No name, no clear connection. Nothing that could place the story into a complete form. Investigators worked to piece together information, to follow leads, to create a narrative that made sense. But every direction led to uncertainty, and slowly, the case changed. It stopped being just an investigation, it became something else. A question that remained open because without identity, a story doesn't fully exist. It doesn't settle, it doesn't conclude, it lingers. In public memory, in quiet discussions. In the uncomfortable realization that something so significant could remain unknown. And that's what made it lasting. Not just what happened, but the fact that it never fully became clear. The presence that didn't stay a pattern without origin. Across different parts of America, there have been accounts that don't fully connect, but feel strangely similar. Encounters with someone who doesn't stay long, someone who appears briefly just enough to be noticed, and then disappears. Descriptions are never fully consistent, but the feeling is A conversation that feels slightly off, a presence that doesn't quite fit, a moment that seems normal, until it isn't. Nothing that can be proven, nothing that can be clearly explained, but enough to leave an impression. And impressions have a way of staying, because when something isn't fully understood, the mind tries to complete it. It fills in the missing parts, creates possibilities, and sometimes those possibilities are more unsettling than reality itself. This isn't a single confirmed person, it's something else, a pattern, one that appears, disappears, and leaves no clear trace behind. And that lack of clarity is what makes it powerful, because what cannot be defined cannot be predicted, and what cannot be predicted cannot be controlled. And when all of these stories come together, the final truth begins to take shape, not about history but about perception. Every story you've just heard, every name, every unknown figure, did something more than exist. They changed how people see the world, not through noise, but through realization that safety is not always visible, that normal is not always real, that understanding has limits, because the truth is, the world has never been as simple as it seems, and it never will be, because somewhere between what we know and what we don't, there will always be stories like these, quiet, unfinished, waiting to be noticed again. And maybe the most unsettling part of all isn't that these stories happened, it's that some of them never really ended.